He stepped on stage to sing for the country he nearly died defending, only to realize his voice was gone. The silence was unbearable. But just as the crowd looked away, Keanu Reeves stood up from the shadows and walked toward him. What happened next stunned the nation and revealed a kind of patriotism no one saw coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains, casting long shadows across the quiet kitchen. The old ceiling fan creaked softly above as Sergeant Raymond Ray Douglas sat at his small round table nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee. His movements were slow, deliberate, weathered by years of habit and silence. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine from the aging floorboards, and the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of a clock mounted crookedly on the wall. In front of him lay a silver star medal resting on a folded handkerchief. Ray picked it up gently, polishing its surface with the edge of his flannel sleeve. The medal glimmered faintly in the morning light, a silent echo of something that once shined much brighter, his voice, his spirit. The young man who once stood tall in the jungles of Vietnam, singing into the darkness while mortars fell. But those days were a lifetime ago. He set the medal down and turned slightly in his chair, glancing toward the mantel in the adjoining room. There, propped against the wall, was a photo in a cracked wooden frame. It showed 6 young men in muddy uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning despite the grime. Ray was in the middle, his mouth open mid-song, caught forever, in a moment when hope was all they had. Most of those men were gone now, some to time, some to war, and one to something that still haunted him every night. He rose from his chair slowly, gripping the table for balance. His lungs gave a soft rattle as he exhaled, and he coughed into the crook of his arm. It wasn't violent, just dry and lingering, the kind of cough that never fully left after the damage had been done. Ray had once been known for a voice like thunder, deep, resonant, almost operatic. His platoon had called him the Singer long before they called him Sergeant. But a collapsed lung during his final mission had taken most of that away. The injury healed, but the voice never did. He made his way to the front door, where a small pile of mail waited beneath the slot. Bills, catalogs, a local veteran center newsletter, and then one envelope that stood out, thicker, formal, embossed with a golden seal. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. His name was handwritten in careful script. He turned it over, hesitated, then opened it with the tip of his pocket knife. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper with a bold header. "You are hereby invited to the National Veterans Tribute at the Lincoln Memorial. You have been chosen as one of 5 honored guests to receive national recognition for your service and contributions to American morale during the Vietnam War." Ray stopped reading. His breath caught in his chest. He read the line again, slower this time. Contributions to morale. A dry laugh escaped him, more of a grunt. His hand trembled slightly as he folded the letter back into its envelope and sat back down. He looked across the room, eyes falling again on the photograph. The smile faded. "Why now?" he whispered. Ray placed the envelope on the table as though it carried more weight than the metal beside it. He leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers to his temples, letting out a slow breath that trembled just enough to betray the emotion underneath. The invitation felt unreal, almost misplaced, like someone else should have received it instead. Someone stronger, someone whole, someone who hadn't spent decades avoiding ceremonies, gatherings, or any place where he might be asked to speak. He looked down at his hands. They were steady enough, but his voice was another story. He hadn't sung in front of anyone in more than 50 years. Even speaking too long made his lungs tighten and ache. There had been a time when he could project his voice across a base camp with ease, steady and confident, lifting spirits when everything else seemed to fall apart. Now a whisper was sometimes all he could manage. He picked up the invitation again. The paper was thick, elegant, more refined than anything that had entered his home in a long time. At the bottom, Typed in clean letters, it said he had been requested to join the stage during a special tribute performance. He read that part twice, then a third time. A hollow feeling filled his chest. They wanted him on stage. Of all people, him. He stood up abruptly as though the chair suddenly felt too small. He walked to the living room, passing the old television set that hadn't been turned on since last year's Memorial Day broadcast. He paused at the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of books he rarely opened anymore. Military histories, old hymnals, a worn blue folder filled with handwritten lyrics he hadn't touched since the 70s. He pulled the folder out, hesitating before opening it. Inside were sheets of lined paper, each holding words he once sang without fear, songs he performed for scared young soldiers huddled behind sandbags, songs that drowned out the sounds of war for just a moment, songs that gave a dying friend a final piece of comfort in the jungle mud. He swallowed hard and shut the folder. He didn't want to remember that night. Not yet. Not today. Ray moved toward the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. His yard was quiet, the street nearly empty. A couple walked their dog across the road. A mail truck rumbled away in the distance. Life moved on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. He had been chosen, recognized for something he had long buried. He rested his hand against the windowsill, the wood cool beneath his palm. "Why me?" he whispered. It wasn't bitterness in his voice. It wasn't pride either. It was disbelief mixed with a fear he hadn't acknowledged in years. The kind of fear that came from being seen again, from stepping back into the light after living so long in the shadows. He folded the curtain back into place and let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but the invitation still sat on the table, waiting for an answer. Ray walked back to the kitchen and lowered himself into the chair again. The envelope was still there, untouched since he set it down. He turned it over slowly, brushing his thumb across the raised gold seal. The symbol of the nation he once fought for. The nation that was now calling him back into the spotlight after decades of silence. He cleared his throat gently, almost out of habit. A thin, raspy sound escaped him. His voice had never fully recovered after the injury on his last deployment. The collapsed lung had taken away the depth and strength that once defined him. The medics told him he was lucky to be alive. They never said he would lose the one thing that gave him purpose when everything around him fell apart. Ray pushed the envelope aside and reached for his mug, even though the coffee had gone cold. He took a small sip anyway, staring at the quiet room around him. The stillness was familiar, predictable. He had learned to live with solitude, even embraced it. It spared him from questions, from memories, from the burden of trying to speak when the words didn't come out the way they once did. But the letter changed something in him. It stirred feelings he thought had vanished years ago. Hope, fear, responsibility. A strange mixture of all three. He stood up again and walked to the hallway where an old mirror hung above a narrow table cluttered with keys and loose change. He looked at his reflection. The lines on his face were deep carved by age and grief and time. His eyes, though, still held a spark of the young man who once led his platoon in song. He straightened his posture slightly, testing how it felt to stand tall again. He opened his mouth, trying to hum a single note. Just one. The sound that came out was faint and airy, more breath than tone. It frustrated him. He tried again. Same result. Ray exhaled slowly and set his hand on the table to steady himself. He picked up the letter once more and studied the date of the ceremony. It was only a week away. Not much time to decide, not much time to prepare. The house felt too quiet all of a sudden, as if waiting for him to make a choice. Through the doorway, the photograph of his platoon seemed to watch him. Young faces frozen in time, men who never had the chance to grow old. "What would you want me to do?" he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word, but even in that weakness, there was a quiet resolve beginning to form. The invitation lay open on the table. He knew deep down that he couldn't ignore it. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall studio windows in Lower Manhattan, painting the room in a soft, golden haze. Keanu Reeves stood near a cluster of amplifiers, bass guitar cradled in his hands as he adjusted a string with quiet concentration. Dogstar was preparing for a small, private performance that night, something intimate and unadvertised, a chance for the band to reconnect with their roots before the upcoming tour dates. The rehearsal space smelled faintly of wood polish and warm cables, the air vibrating with the soft hum of equipment waiting to come alive. Keanu played a slow, steady line, letting each note ring out before fading into silence. The other band members were setting up nearby, chatting casually about the set list and laughing about old memories from cramped backroom performances in the 90s. But Keanu's focus drifted. His playing slowed, then stopped. He rested the bass against his leg and exhaled, sensing something shifting in him, even before he understood why. A soft knock echoed from the hallway. One of the studio assistants stepped inside, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. The assistant handed it to Keanu with a small nod. "This just arrived for you. Marked urgent." Keanu thanked him, set his bass down carefully, and turned the envelope in his hands. The seal was embossed with the emblem of the National Veterans Tribute. He tore it open quietly and unfolded the letter inside. It was an invitation, not as a guest of honor, not as a speaker, not as celebrity attention, simply as a private attendee. He scanned the content, eyes narrowing slightly at the line describing the ceremony's purpose. It wasn't a fundraiser or a publicity-driven event. It was a national moment of gratitude for aging veterans, especially those who had endured unseen wounds that followed them home from wars no one wanted to remember. Keanu leaned back against a tall equipment case, reading the rest of the schedule. A list of honorees was printed near the bottom. Then he saw the name, Raymond Douglas. He read it again, slower this time. Something about it tugged at his memory. He tried to place it, searching through decades of faces and stories he had encountered at charity, events, hospitals, memorials, and quiet one-on-one visits with wounded soldiers. The name carried weight, a feeling, a sense of familiarity he couldn't explain yet. He lowered the letter, slightly staring ahead at nothing. Dogstar continued rehearsing behind him, the drums testing their rhythm, the guitar warming up with a gentle melody. But Keanu remained still quiet, absorbing the unexpected gravity that had landed in his hands. The letter wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request, but it felt like something he wasn't meant to ignore. He folded it neatly and slid it into the inside pocket of his worn leather jacket. The decision settled in him with an almost physical certainty. He was going. Rehearsal continued, but Keanu's attention drifted farther with every passing minute. He picked up his bass again, trying to rejoin the rhythm the others had naturally fallen into, but the notes landed without conviction. His fingers moved out of habit more than intention. A quiet weight had settled in his chest, the kind that signaled something important was taking shape just outside the edges of understanding. Brett, the drummer, noticed first. He paused mid-fill and leaned over the kit. "Everything good, man?" Keanu gave a small nod, soft and polite as always. "Yeah, just thinking." Brett knew him well enough not to pry. He resumed adjusting a snare stand while Keanu set his bass aside again. The room filled with the gentle rustle of cables and soft tuning noises, but none of it pulled him back fully. His mind kept returning to the name in the letter, Raymond Douglas. He had met countless veterans over the years, but certain ones stayed with him in ways he never shared publicly. Men who carried stories they tried to bury deep. Families who had lost someone but found strength in honoring their memory. Keanu never spoke about these encounters in interviews or documentaries. Those moments weren't for cameras, they were for the heart. He took the letter from his jacket once more and read it again, tracing the clean lines of the printed text. The ceremony would take place at the Lincoln Memorial, a symbolic gathering meant to celebrate courage that had gone unrecognized for far too long. The invitation said the event would highlight veterans whose contributions had uplifted morale in the darkest moments of battle. Keanu lingered on that phrase. Uplifted morale. He wondered what Ray had done, what song he had sung, what moment buried in the fog of war had made enough difference that someone decades later still remembered. The question pulled at him. He found himself picturing a younger man in uniform standing in the mud, surrounded by frightened soldiers with exhaustion etched into their faces. A man trying to lift them up with a voice stronger than fear. A voice that fought even when bullets rained down. Something about that image felt familiar. Not because Keanu knew Ray, but because he had met others like him, quiet heroes who didn't expect recognition. He glanced around the studio one more time. The band was almost ready to begin another run-through. The night held a comfortable familiarity, a predictable rhythm that came with music. But something deeper in him pushed against that comfort. He folded the invitation again and placed it back in his jacket. "Guys," he said, quietly, "I need to step out for a bit." There was no surprise, no judgment, just nods of understanding. Keanu left the rehearsal space and stepped into the hallway. The sounds of muffled music faded behind him as he walked through the stairwell and exited onto the busy Manhattan street. Evening traffic hummed, people moved quickly along sidewalks, and neon-lit signs flickered in the distance. But Keanu felt oddly still, as though the world had slowed around him. He looked at the sky above the tall buildings, then at the folded letter in his hand. Something about this felt meant. Keanu walked along the sidewalk with the letter still folded in his hand, the cool New York air brushing against his face. Horns echoed in the distance, and fragments of conversations drifted from passing pedestrians. But none of it reached him clearly. His mind stayed fixed on that single name, the one printed in simple black ink that somehow carried the weight of an entire generation. Raymond Douglas. He stopped at the curb and waited for the crosswalk light, staring ahead, as if seeing through the traffic, the people, the noise. The Veterans Tribute wasn't the kind of event he typically attended without a specific purpose. Yet the moment he read Ray's name, a quiet certainty settled into his thoughts. It wasn't fame pulling him. It wasn't publicity or expectation. It was something more instinctive, something human. The light changed. He crossed the street, slowly weaving between hurried New Yorkers. His leather jacket felt heavier than usual, with the letter tucked inside. He thought about the veterans he had met at hospitals, the stories whispered in recovery rooms, the gratitude that often turned into guilt for surviving when others didn't. He never forgot any of them. He reached a quiet alley beside the studio and walked toward the motorcycle parked near the wall. The familiar sight grounded him. The black frame, the worn grips, the subtle scratches from long rides on lonely highways. Riding gave him space to think, to feel, to breathe in the world without being swallowed by attention. He stood beside the bike for a moment, running his hand across the cool metal. The decision was already set in his mind, but he lingered there, letting the weight of it settle fully. He wasn't being asked to perform, to speak, or to take the spotlight. The invitation made that clear. He was simply invited to be present. But something told him that presence alone might not be the end of it. He took a breath and slid the folded invitation back into the inside pocket of his jacket. The paper pressed against his chest, steady and warm. He zipped the jacket closed, sealing the letter in place, as if sealing the commitment itself. He mounted the bike and sat still for a long moment, letting the evening breeze brush against him. Then he reached for his helmet and pulled it on. The engine roared to life with a deep, familiar growl. He wasn't riding to clear his head anymore. He was riding toward something. Ray stood in the middle of his small bedroom, the afternoon sun cutting across the floor in warm streaks. His suitcase sat open on the bed, half filled with neatly folded clothes he wasn't sure he would ever wear during the trip. He ran his fingers over the fabric of his old dress uniform, the deep green still intact despite years sealed away in the back of his closet. He hesitated before lifting it, the weight heavier than it used to be, not because of the fabric, but because of the memories stitched into every thread. He laid the uniform across the bed, smoothing out the creases with a slow, careful hand. It had taken him years to stop feeling the impulse to check the pockets for letters' spare rounds or torn-out pages of hymns he carried for nights when the jungle felt endless. Everything about the uniform reminded him of a younger version of himself, a version that had walked with straight shoulders and a voice strong enough to carry across a platoon under fire. Ray reached for the small wooden box on his dresser. Inside, cushioned by a piece of felt, was his harmonica. The silver casing was scratched in places, a faded engraving on one side, showing the initials of a friend who never made it home. Ray lifted it gently, holding it beneath his nose and breathing in the faint metallic scent. This harmonica had survived mud, rain, fire, and shrapnel. It had survived the one night that changed his life forever. He turned toward the mirror, propped against the opposite wall. The reflection staring back at him looked older than he felt, but the eyes were the same ones that once watched over frightened boys in the middle of chaos. He lifted the harmonica to his lips and tried a simple note. The sound that came out was thin, uneven, barely more than a whisper of what it used to be. His lungs tightened with the effort, and he pulled the harmonica away, frustrated. He set it gently on the dresser and stared at the mirror again. "Maybe I shouldn't go," he muttered. His voice cracked softly. He barely recognized the rasp that came out, but it was his. It was all he had now. Ray stepped closer to the mirror, placing both hands on the dresser to steady himself. He opened his mouth and tried to sing the first line of America, the beautiful, the same song he once sang with pride, the same words he sang on a night he would never forget. "Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies." The words barely formed. A rough cough cut through the air. Ray winced, closing his eyes as the pain spread across his chest. When he finally caught his breath again, he whispered the words he feared most. "They'll laugh." He felt his throat tighten as he looked down, shame washing over him for feeling weak. He was a soldier, a man who had walked through fire and come out alive. But this felt different. This felt like facing an old ghost he wasn't sure he could defeat. Still, he turned back to the suitcase. He folded the uniform with extra care, placed the harmonica beside it, and closed the case with a firm, deliberate motion. He wasn't certain he could sing anymore, but he could still show up. Ray carried the suitcase to the living room and set it beside the worn-down armchair where he usually spent his evenings. He sat slowly, his joints stiff from age, but his mind sharper than he let on. The folded invitation lay on the coffee table. He picked it up again, tracing the embossed lettering with his thumb. The seal gleamed faintly under the lamplight. He read the words carefully, letting each line sink deeper than before. Honored guest, national recognition, tribute performance. His stomach tightened. He wasn't being asked to sing. No one expected him to. But standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people felt just as terrifying. He wasn't the same man anymore. The uniform didn't fit the same way. His voice certainly didn't. He placed the invitation back down and leaned into the chair. His gaze drifted to the mantel again. The photograph of his platoon stared back at him, frozen in time. A memory tugged at him, slow and painful, pulling him back to a night he tried for decades to forget. The memory came without warning. It was Vietnam, the air thick with humid heat and smoke. Rain hammered the ground in relentless sheets. The sky glowed orange from distant fires that never seemed to extinguish. Ray remembered the mud clinging to his boots, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the metallic taste of fear. Their platoon had been ambushed hours earlier. Several were wounded. One was dying. They were pinned down behind a ridge of sandbags, their medical supplies dwindling. The gunfire had finally slowed to silence, but the enemy could return at any moment. The night felt endless, every shadow a threat. One soldier, a young man named Ellis, lay against Ray's shoulder. He was barely 19. His breathing was shallow, his face pale beneath the grime. He whispered, "Sarge, sing something. Feels like home when you do." Ray had hesitated. The jungle was too quiet, too dangerous. But Ellis's trembling hand tightened around Ray's arm, and Ray knew fear couldn't silence what mattered. He closed his eyes and sang, "America the Beautiful." His voice carried through the rain, steady and strong. The other soldiers listened, some with tears streaking through the dirt on their cheeks. The melody rose above the tension, above the threat of gunfire, above the pain. It gave warmth to the wounded, comfort to the dying, hope to the living. Ellis took his final breath before the last verse. Ray remembered how he pressed his forehead to Ellis's and whispered, "You're home now." The weight of that moment became a permanent scar heavier than anything the war had carved into his body. The flashback faded, and Ray blinked away the sting in his eyes. He looked at the suitcase, the uniform, the harmonica, the tools of a past life. the remnants of a night that had defined him more than any medal. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. If they knew the truth, he muttered, they wouldn't want me on that stage. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was simply a man who survived when others didn't. A man who had sung for men who never made it home. He stood shakily and walked back to the mirror in the hallway. He stared at his own reflection, old and worn, but familiar. He tried again to hum the same line he once sang in the rain. The sound cracked. He flinched, gripping the edge of the mirror. "They'll laugh," he whispered, fear creeping into his words. "Or pity me." But the image staring back didn't flinch. He stepped away from the mirror, took a long breath, and returned to the suitcase. The decision had already been made. Ray woke before dawn, long before the alarm clock buzzed on the nightstand. The sky outside the window was still dark, the quiet kind that carried the chill of early morning. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, hands resting on his knees, listening to the steady but weakened rhythm of his own breath. Today he would leave for Washington. Today he would face the part of himself he had tried to bury for half a century. He dressed slowly, choosing a plain button-up shirt and his old wool coat. The suitcase waited by the door. Beside it sat a folded American flag carefully wrapped in a protective case, the one given to him after his best friend's funeral years ago. Ray picked it up tenderly, feeling the textured fabric beneath his fingertips. The weight of it grounded him. He knew he couldn't walk onto that bus without it. It was the last promise he had ever made to a fallen brother. He placed the flag beneath his arm and took one final look around the house. The silence felt heavier this morning, as if the walls themselves understood what this journey meant. He flicked off the lights and stepped outside into the cold morning air, locking the door behind him with a small, decisive click. The walk to the bus stop was short, but every step felt like he was crossing a bridge from the past to the present. His breath puffed in small clouds as he walked, the flag tucked carefully against his chest. A few cars rolled by their headlights, casting momentary streaks of light across the pavement. When Ray reached the bus stop, no one else was there. The shelter's metal bench was cold beneath him as he sat and waited. His suitcase rested at his feet, his hands wrapped firmly around the flag. He didn't try to sing again. He didn't test his voice. He simply breathed and waited. The bus appeared over the hill, rumbling toward him with a deep mechanical groan. As it slowed to a stop, Ray stood up, tightening his grip on the flag. He stepped aboard. Whatever waited for him in Washington, he would face it. Not as the man he used to be, but as the man he still was. The bus from Arlington rolled to a gentle stop near the Lincoln Memorial, just as the first wave of morning light touched the reflecting pool. Ray stepped down slowly, gripping the handrail for balance as the cold air brushed against his cheeks. His suitcase felt heavier today, and the folded flag beneath his arm pressed firmly against his side, reminding him with every breath why he had come. People streamed toward the memorial grounds from all directions. Some wore dress uniforms still crisp with medals. Others arrived with Kane's walkers or the quiet support of family members holding their arms. Volunteers guided guests through security, while news cameras began assembling on the far side of the lawn, their lenses glinting like watchful eyes under the rising sun. Ray kept his head low as he followed a small group toward the check-in area for honored veterans. He handed the coordinator his invitation with a stiff, weathered hand. She scanned the list quickly, then smiled warmly. "Sergeant Raymond Douglas, welcome. This way, please." He nodded, but couldn't form words. His throat felt tight again, the whisper of a cough lingering deep in his lungs. He cleared it quietly, hoping no one noticed. The coordinator led him behind a long row of white chairs, arranged neatly across the memorial steps. A stage had been set up at the center, flanked by two towering American flags swaying gently in the breeze. Ray was guided toward a tented waiting area behind the stage, where 4 other elderly veterans sat with their spouses or caregivers. Their dress uniforms gleamed under the soft light, their caps decorated with patches from wars the country spoke of differently now. Ray's empty seat was tucked between a Korean War medic and a Gulf War radio operator. They both greeted him kindly, but Ray could only manage a polite nod. His voice wasn't ready, and neither was he. He sat down slowly, resting the suitcase beside his feet and securing the folded flag on his lap. Every sound seemed amplified. The footsteps of staff, the distant chatter of spectators, the humming of microphones being tested on stage. A slow, anxious tremor settled into his hands, so subtle only he noticed it. He clasped them together to stop the shaking. From where he sat, Ray had a partial view of the crowd forming in front of the memorial. Hundreds of chairs lined the space, with more people gathering behind the barriers. He saw families with children, older couples, students with small flags tucked into their backpacks. The atmosphere held a respectful stillness, almost sacred, as if everyone understood they were part of something meaningful. On the far left side of the audience, seating, Ray noticed a man sitting quietly in the third row. Long black hair, dark sunglasses, a black jacket resting casually over his shoulders. Keanu Reeves sat with his hands folded loosely, head slightly bowed, as if trying not to draw attention. Most people didn't seem to recognize him. Those who did chose not to disturb him. Ray didn't think much of it at first, but something about Keanu's stillness made him look a second time. Keanu wasn't scanning the crowd or adjusting his phone like others. He was watching the stage, focused, present, in a way that felt unusual for a celebrity accustomed to the noise of attention. Ray turned away, unaware of the role this quiet observer would soon play in his life. Behind him, an announcer began testing the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We will begin shortly." Ray's heartbeat quickened. He tightened his grip on the flag and forced his shoulders to stay steady. The ceremony was about to begin. A soft hush fell over the crowd as the host stepped onto the stage, adjusting the microphone with a careful touch. His suit was crisp, his demeanor formal, yet warm, the tone of someone who understood the weight of the moment. Behind him, the marble pillars of the Lincoln Memorial rose like silent guardians over the ceremony. "Thank you all for joining us today," the host began. "We gather not only to honor the bravery of our nation's veterans, but to remember the stories that shaped this country. Today, 5 heroes stand among us." Applause rippled across the audience, gentle at first, then growing stronger. Ray felt it like a vibration in his chest. He sat straighter, but kept his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't feel like a hero, not in the way others defined it. He was simply a man who did what he had to do. The Korean War medic beside him leaned over and whispered, "Breathe, brother. Moments like this pass quicker than you think." Ray nodded faintly but didn't trust his voice to respond. Volunteers motioned for the honored veterans to stand by. One by one, the others rose confidently. Ray stood last, pressing a hand to his knee for support. The shaking in his hands had grown worse, so he tightened his grip on the folded flag until his knuckles turned white. He held it against his chest, not just as a keepsake, but as a shield. The host continued reading the history of each veteran's service. Their accomplishments echoed through the speaker's medals, earned lives saved, sacrifices made. Each introduction was met with applause and respectful silence. Ray waited for his turn, a sinking weight pulling at him with every passing second. He could feel the old fear claw at his throat. The fear of being seen, of being called forward, of being asked to be more than the man he had become. Just behind the wing curtain, Ray glanced sideways and saw the stage entrance leading directly into the bright sunlight. He could almost feel the eyes that would turn to him the moment his name was called. He inhaled slowly, struggling to steady his breath. The host moved through the 4th introduction and paused for a dramatic breath. "Our final honoree," he said, "is a man whose voice once rose above the gunfire of Vietnam, a man whose courage reached beyond the battlefield to uplift the spirits of his entire platoon." Ray froze. The host continued, "Sergeant Raymond Douglas." The applause that followed felt distant, muted, as if Ray were hearing it from underwater. He forced himself to step forward, each movement stiff and cautious. The coordinator gently touched his elbow to guide him. But the moment he stepped from the shade into the sunlight, it felt like the world sharpened around him. The crowd rose to their feet. Ray blinked, overwhelmed. He hadn't expected that. Camera flashes glimmered like tiny bursts of lightning. Children waved flags. Older veterans saluted. Husbands and wives placed their hands over their hearts. Thousands of eyes focused on him, and the echo of his heartbeat thundered in his ears. Somewhere in the third row, Keanu Reeves lifted his sunglasses slightly, not in surprise but in recognition. His gaze lingered on Ray with a softness that contrasted the formality around him. He didn't clap loudly or cheer. He simply watched with a quiet, steady presence, as if sensing something the rest of the crowd couldn't see. Ray stepped onto the stage, gripping the flag protectively. The host gestured for him to stand center stage with the others, but Ray remained slightly behind them, shoulders tense, breathing shallow. The ceremony continued, but something in the air had shifted. Ray could feel it. He didn't know what would happen next, but something was coming. Ray stood at the edge of the stage, the sunlight warming his face, while the cold weight of uncertainty pressed against his chest. The host continued speaking, but Ray's attention drifted to the crowd. Blur of faces and flashing cameras that made his breath shorten. He clutched the folded flag tighter, grounding himself in the memory of why he carried it. A volunteer motioned for him to step forward with the other honorees. Ray hesitated, then moved a single step, his boots feeling heavier with every inch. The applause softened into an expectant silence, the kind that made every heartbeat sound louder. In the third row, Keanu Reeves lowered his sunglasses completely, his eyes fixed on Ray with a calm, steady focus. There was no judgment in his expression, recognition as though he saw the storm building beneath Ray's composed exterior. Ray swallowed hard, his throat tightened, a familiar rasp threatened to escape. He looked at the host, then at the microphone, resting only a few feet away. He wasn't supposed to speak today. He wasn't expected to perform. But something about the moment made his lungs tremble, as if the past itself were rising to surface. Ray felt the stage lights growing warmer as he stood near the edge of the platform, waiting for what would come next. The other honorees had already stepped forward, each receiving a respectful applause that echoed across the open-air space. Now only Ray remained slightly behind them, holding the folded flag like a fragile piece of his past he wasn't ready to surrender. The host glanced toward him with a gentle, encouraging nod, the kind meant to say you're safe, even if the words weren't spoken aloud. Ray wished he believed it. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his legs stiff from the tension threading through every muscle. His breath trembled when he pulled it in, and the tight burning in his chest signaled the beginning of the struggle he dreaded most. Then the host spoke into the microphone, clear and resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming Sergeant Raymond Douglas for a very special tribute." Applause erupted instantly across the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It rolled forward like a wave, thousands of hands coming together for him alone. Ray felt the vibration of it in the floorboards beneath his boots. For a brief moment, he wondered if the applause was meant for the man he used to be, or the fading version of himself standing there now. He stepped forward, slow, careful. His shoulders stiffened with each step as though the air grew heavier the closer he came to the center of the stage. When he reached the microphone, the spotlight hit him directly, bright enough to dissolve the edges of his vision. The warmth of it made his skin prickle. His heartbeat pulsed in his ears. A soft instrumental track began to play. The opening notes of America the Beautiful drifted through the speakers, gentle and familiar. The same melody he had once sung beneath a storm-soaked sky in Vietnam. It struck him deep in the chest, stirring memories he had spent decades trying to bury. Ray's throat tightened. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out, not a note, not a hum, not even a whisper. He tried again, this time pushing from the depths of his lungs, hoping something, anything, would break through the wall inside him. A dry cough burst from his throat, sharp and painful. The microphone amplified the sound, turning the harmless cough into a harsh echo across the memorial grounds. Ray winced, lifting a hand to his chest as if that could steady the ache inside. A small snicker came from somewhere in the back rows, then another. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to pierce him in a place civilians could never see. Enough to reopen a wound that had never fully healed. Ray blinked hard, feeling his eyes burn. Tears threatened to escape as he tried to form the first words of the song again. His lips trembled, his jaw locked, his voice refused to come. The music continued softly behind him, mocking him with the melody he could not reach. Ray lowered his head. The stage lights blurred and the world seemed to tilt slightly. "I'm sorry," he croaked, his voice barely audible, broken and thin. The microphone caught every fragile syllable. A single tear slid down his cheek. The soft instrumental continued playing, unaware of the silence now consuming the stage. Ray tried once more to lift his head, but the weight of the moment pushed down on him with a force he didn't expect. His throat felt raw, his lungs ached. The cough had scraped something deep inside, leaving a burning sting that made every breath feel like effort. The audience, unsure how to react, shifted uncomfortably. A few people whispered, others cleared their throats or looked at the ground. Parents pulled their children closer, hoping to shield them from the awkwardness unfolding on the stage. Ray sensed it all. He felt every ripple of discomfort washing across the crowd in front of him. He clutched the folded flag tighter, anchoring himself against the rising wave of humiliation. It reminded him of nights when the wounded leaned against him for comfort, trusting his voice to steady their fear. Now, he couldn't even steady himself. A second cough escaped him, harsher than the first. The microphone amplified it again, filling the space with the brittle sound of a man battling both his body and his memories. The music faltered for a moment as the sound engineer hesitated. Then the track lowered slightly, as if softening to avoid hurting him further. Ray's eyes stung. He lifted his gaze enough to see the blurred faces in the front rows. Some looked concerned, others sympathetic, but just a few wore expressions he dreaded most. Pity, confusion, even annoyance. They didn't know him. They didn't understand the years of silence he carried. They only saw an old man who had failed at something he once did with ease. A voice from the back called out, not loud enough to be fully heard, but the tone cut straight through him. A muffled laugh followed. Someone else whispered something that made a few heads turn. Ray felt his heart sink. He swallowed hard, willing his voice to cooperate, but his vocal cords refused. His breath rattled in his chest, shallow and uneven. Every instinct told him to step back, to retreat into the shadows behind the stage, but his feet stayed planted, heavy and frozen. He looked toward the host, who offered him a soft, reassuring smile. The host stepped forward slightly, ready to intervene if needed, but he held back, giving Ray space to decide for himself. Ray's lips moved again, forming the first word of the song. Oh? Nothing. The silence returned thick and unforgiving. A tear escaped the corner of his eye and slid down the deep lines of his cheek. He let it fall. There was no strength left to hide it. The tear dropped onto the flag, leaving a tiny, dark mark on the fabric like a blemish on something sacred. Ray bowed his head and closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. The words cracked through the stillness, thin as paper. The instrumental faded out slowly, as if retreating from the moment. The audience was completely silent, now held in a fragile balance between empathy and confusion. Ray felt small on that massive stage, smaller than he had felt in years, smaller than he had felt even in the jungle when he held dying men in his arms. Pain there had been physical. Pain here was something different, something deeper, sharper, lodged in the core of who he once was. He tightened his grip on the flag again, steadying himself as the last notes of the song faded into nothing. Ray had never felt more alone. Ray stood frozen, the silence pressing against him like a weight he couldn't lift. The vastness of the memorial grounds made him feel exposed, as if every flaw and every weakness he carried had been magnified under the bright lights. His breath trembled as he tried to regain control, but the embarrassment clung to him like a second skin. He lowered his head further, wishing the stage would swallow him whole. In the front rows, a few audience members shifted uneasily. Someone cleared their throat. Another person murmured, "Poor man," with a tone Ray couldn't decipher. Sympathy or dismissal, he wasn't sure. Both hurt in equal measure. He tightened his fingers around the flag until they ached, holding onto it as the only solid thing left in the moment. From somewhere behind the crowd, a child asked, "Why isn't he singing?" The innocent question struck Ray harder than any rifle blast had. Children didn't understand the price of silence. They never should. Ray drew in a fragile breath and lifted his head just enough to see the blurred outline of the microphone. It stood tall and polished, untouched by the years that had stolen his voice. He wished he could live up to what people expected. He wished he could still give the world what he once gave men dying in the dark. Instead, his voice failed him again when he tried to speak, breaking into another rough cough. A soft gasp rippled across the audience. Ray closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered for the third time, barely audible. A small tear slid down his cheek, falling onto the stage floor this time. He felt the moment slipping away from him. He didn't know that someone else was about to step into it. The silence that followed Ray's apology felt like a living thing. It stretched across the memorial grounds, heavy and suffocating, settling over every seat, every row, every breath. No one moved, no one spoke. The air wavered with the weight of a moment that was breaking an old soldier in front of their eyes. Ray stood trembling beside the microphone, shoulders bent, gripping the folded flag, as though it were the last piece of strength he had left. The spotlight above him felt painfully bright. His lungs burned, his throat ached, his heart pounded unevenly. He wanted to step back, to slip into the shadows and disappear before anyone could look at him the way he feared most, before pity could swallow him whole. The host shifted uncomfortably beside him, unsure whether to intervene or give Ray space. A few people in the crowd lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the vulnerability unfolding on the stage. Others watched with sadness, helpless to change the moment. And then, without warning, a sound broke through the stillness. A chair scraped back in the third row. Slowly, deliberately, one man rose to his feet. Keanu Reeves stood tall among the seated crowd, his long black hair catching the sunlight, his expression steady and unreadable. He removed his sunglasses, revealing a gaze filled with something deeper than surprise or sympathy. Something closer to understanding. Ray didn't see him at first. His head was bowed too low, his shame too blinding, but the audience felt the shift immediately. A ripple passed through them, subtle but unmistakable. Cameras turned. People whispered his name under their breath. Keanu didn't acknowledge any of them. He simply began walking down the aisle. Not quickly, not dramatically, not seeking attention. Each step was measured, quiet, certain. As he reached the front, a security guard instinctively stepped forward, but paused when Keanu gave a small, respectful nod. Something in his presence made it clear he wasn't there to cause disruption. He was there because he needed to be. The host looked puzzled, unsure how to respond, but he didn't stop him. Keanu stepped onto the stage. Ray finally lifted his head, startled by the sound of footsteps beside him. When he saw Keanu approaching, his eyes widened with confusion. He didn't understand why someone like him would walk toward someone like Ray, a man who had just failed in front of thousands. Keanu approached with no hesitation. He reached out gently and placed a steady hand on Ray's shoulder. The contact made Ray's breath hitch. It felt grounding, real human. His fingers loosened slightly around the flag as he looked at Keanu, searching for an explanation. Keanu leaned in, lowering his voice to something only Ray could hear. "You sang for this country," he whispered. "Let me sing for you." Ray stared at him, stunned. He didn't know how to respond. His voice wouldn't let him. The audience gasped softly, the sound sweeping across the memorial like a gentle wind. No one expected this. No one anticipated a moment that would tilt the entire ceremony into something unforgettable. Keanu released Ray's shoulder only long enough to step toward the microphone. He didn't ask for music. He didn't ask for permission. He stood before the crowd, took a breath, and prepared to give something raw, imperfect, and deeply human. Keanu stood before the microphone with a stillness that drew every eye in the crowd. He didn't adjust his jacket. He didn't look around. He simply waited for his breath to settle his chest, rising and falling in a slow, measured rhythm. The sunlight framed him against the marble backdrop, making the moment feel suspended in time. Behind him, Ray remained frozen in place. His throat tightened with confusion as he watched Keanu prepare to do something that made no logical sense. Keanu wasn't on the program. He wasn't part of the ceremony. He wasn't even supposed to be on stage. Yet here he was standing at the microphone as if it were exactly where he belonged. The host took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Reeves, if you—" Keanu lifted one hand gently, signaling that he understood the concern, but needed no further instruction. The host stopped mid-sentence, recognizing something in Keanu's expression that made him step back. There was no arrogance in Keanu's presence, no entitlement, only intention. The music engineer, unsure of what to do, hovered near his equipment. Keanu offered a small shake of his head. No track, no accompaniment, just silence. He looked at Ray again, his voice soft enough that only Ray could hear. "I've got this," he murmured. For a moment, Ray's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't identify. Gratitude, shame, relief. It was all tangled together, too heavy to name. Keanu faced the microphone once more. The crowd leaned forward collectively, breath held. Then he began. The first note slipped out low and rough. His voice wasn't polished or trained. It didn't glide smoothly the way professional singers' voices do. It cracked slightly on the opening word, and he paused just long enough to steady himself before continuing. "Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies." His tone carried through the memorial grounds, imperfect but honest. There was no attempt to impress anyone. Keanu wasn't performing. He was offering something. A gesture of dignity, a shield for a man who had stood alone a moment too long. People in the audience straightened in their seats. Others touched their hearts without realizing it. No one spoke. No one laughed. The energy shifted completely from discomfort to reverence. Ray stared at Keanu's back, his eyes widening with every note. It had been decades since anyone sang that song on his behalf. He felt something loosen inside him, something he didn't know was clenched. His fingers trembled around the flag, but for the first time today, the trembling wasn't from fear. Keanu continued, his voice growing steadier as he went. "For amber waves of grain." A man in the fourth row removed his cap. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Veterans stood slowly, their backs stiff, but their hearts warm. Even the children in the crowd went quiet, sensing the gravity of what was happening. Ray felt memories flash through his mind, overlapping like photographs, layered on top of each other. Mud, rain, smoke, men holding each other in the dark, the last breaths of boys who never saw home. And over all of it, the faint echo of his own younger voice singing the same words into the chaos. He blinked hard, trying to ground himself in the present, in this moment, in this unexpected grace. Keanu reached the end of the first verse. His voice wavered on the last word, not out of weakness, but out of emotion. Ray felt something break inside him, a quiet, relieving crack that allowed light to seep through. Keanu took a breath to begin the next line. Ray bowed his head slightly, as if to receive something he didn't think he deserved. The moment was no longer about failure. It was becoming something else entirely. Keanu continued singing, his voice steadying with each passing line. There was no hint of hesitation now. The raw sincerity in his tone filled the space where music had failed moments earlier. Every word reached the edges of the memorial grounds, drifting between the pillars, settling in the hearts of the people watching. Ray felt the sound wash over him like warmth on a winter morning. It wasn't just the melody, it was the intention behind it. Every note carried a quiet message that Ray understood even without it being spoken. He wasn't alone. He wasn't being pitied. Someone had stepped beside him, not to overshadow him, but to hold the moment upright so it wouldn't collapse on top of him. Keanu reached the final line of the verse and let the last word linger just long enough to honor its meaning. Then he lowered his head, eyes closed, briefly releasing a breath that trembled slightly with emotion. When he opened his eyes again, he turned toward Ray. Keanu stepped away from the microphone and returned to Ray's side. The crowd remained silent, unsure if the moment was over or if something more was coming. Ray's gaze met Keanu's, and for a brief second the years of guilt and silence weighed less heavily. Keanu placed a gentle hand on Ray's shoulder again. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't try to encourage Ray to sing. He simply looked at him as if saying without words that what Ray had given the world long ago mattered, that even now, broken voice and trembling hands, he still mattered. The audience watched in stunned quiet. They had witnessed something unexpected, not a performance, a rescue, and it wasn't over yet. Keanu stepped back toward the microphone, the soft breeze tugging gently at the hem of his jacket. For a brief moment, he let his eyes sweep across the memorial grounds. The crowd was silent, suspended between disbelief and awe. Thousands of people waited, not knowing what would happen next, but sensing they were witnessing something rare, something meant to be remembered. He took one slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the next moment will change everything around him. Then he began, "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies." The words emerged raw and unpolished, a voice shaped not by training, but by sincerity. It cracked slightly on the first phrase, trembling just enough to reveal the emotion behind it. Keanu didn't hide the imperfections. He didn't try to sing like a professional. He sang like a man speaking from the heart. The sound drifted across the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, echoing gently off the marble pillars. The melody soaked into the quiet morning air, carrying over the crowd in a way no recording ever could. Ray watched him, stunned by the simplicity and power of it. The disbelief on his face softened into something he couldn't name, something like gratitude mixed with pain. His hands trembled as he clutched the folded flag to his chest, the fabric rustling softly. Then, almost without thinking, Ray placed his free hand over his heart. It was an instinct he hadn't followed in years, a gesture that once came naturally during ceremonies and memorials. But now, in this moment, it felt different. It felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. As Keanu continued singing, something began to stir in the audience. First, a single veteran in the front row rose from his seat, spine straight eyes steady, his hand pressed firmly over his chest. Then another rose beside him. Then a third. Within moments, an entire row of veterans stood at attention, their aging bodies lifting with dignity, despite canes, stiff joints, and trembling limbs. Their faces held reverence, respect, and recognition, not for Keanu, but for Ray, for the moment, for the emotion unfolding before them. The movement spread like a quiet wave. Parents lifted their children onto their hips. Teenagers straightened in their seats. Adults rose slowly, caught between awe and emotion they didn't know how to express. Some placed hands over their hearts, others saluted, a few bowed their heads. By the time Keanu reached the second line, nearly the entire audience was standing for amber waves of grain. A woman in the middle section wiped tears from her cheeks. A teenage boy next to her swallowed hard, eyes wide. A man in a wheelchair lifted his chin, placing his hand firmly against his chest. Ray's throat tightened as he watched them. This wasn't for him apologizing on the stage. This wasn't for his failed voice. This was for something deeper, for everything he once represented, for everything that memory refused to let him forget. Keanu continued with steady determination. For purple mountain majesties. The words trembled again, but the crack in his voice only deepened the emotion. It pulled something unspoken from the crowd. It reached places polished performances never could. Ray closed his eyes, letting the song wash over him. He felt the past soften its grip just a little. The anthem was becoming a moment of healing. Keanu's voice carried into the open air with a kind of fragile courage, a sound that wasn't perfect, but felt undeniably true. Every note reached Ray like a lifeline thrown across years of silence, regret, and memories buried too deep to speak about. Ray stood motionless beside him, his hand pressed firmly over his heart, the folded flag still held tightly against his side. As the anthem continued, the atmosphere shifted even further. Veterans across the memorial grounds straightened with military precision. Some stood despite painful joints, leaning on walkers or the arms of loved ones. Others, too weak to rise, placed trembling hands over their hearts. For them, standing wasn't necessary. Their eyes alone told the story of what this moment meant. Keanu's voice wavered again, this time on a higher phrase. He paused for half a beat, not to recover technically, but emotionally. His lips pressed together as he regained his breath, then he pushed forward into the next line. Above the fruited plain. The crack in his voice deepened here, revealing a vulnerability that resonated through the audience. The imperfections weren't flaws. They were human. They were real. They were what made the moment powerful. A man in uniform near the back instinctively saluted. A few rows up, an elderly woman pressed a tissue to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. A child, who had been fidgeting only moments before, now stood perfectly still, staring at Keanu as if seeing something sacred unfold. Ray watched them all through blurred vision. His own tears welled but didn't fall yet. The ache in his throat eased and tightened at the same time, a contradiction he didn't understand but accepted. He felt alive in a way he hadn't felt in years, as though the shattered pieces of his past were being gathered together, gently, respectfully. Keanu closed his eyes as he entered the next verse. It wasn't for show. It was because the emotion in the words demanded it. America, America. The sound quivered, almost broke, then steadied again. Each syllable carried weight, shaped by sincerity rather than technique. The song no longer belonged to the stage. It belonged to everyone listening. In the stillness, even the wind seemed to pause. Ray's grip on the flag softened as his trembling eased. The edges of the folded cloth pressed lightly against his palm, anchoring him. He whispered the word America under his breath, but no sound came out. It didn't matter. The gesture alone brought him peace he hadn't expected to find today. As Keanu reached the final lines of the verse, something extraordinary happened. The veterans who stood in the front row lifted their voices, not in song, but in a quiet, trembling hum. Some barely formed the notes. Others simply mouthed the words. It wasn't coordinated, rehearsed, or planned. It was instinct, a collective echo of memory, a tribute to the moments when they, too, once sang in barracks, in foxholes, in lonely patrol camps, under foreign skies. A few members of the audience began humming as well, softer than the breeze, but powerful in its unity. The sound layered behind Keanu like a supportive choir made of thousands of imperfect, heartfelt voices. Keanu didn't turn or smile. He simply kept singing, steady, grounded, almost reverent. His voice blended with theirs, forming a moment of unity that felt larger than the ceremony itself. Ray's breath hitched. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel voiceless. He felt understood. Keanu reached the final stretch of the anthem, his voice growing steadier as the emotional tide behind him rose. The humming from the crowd softened, giving him space to carry the last lines alone. Ray watched him with a trembling breath, feeling each note settle into a place inside him he'd believed was ruined beyond repair. And crown thy good with brotherhood. Keanu's voice cracked gently on the word brotherhood, but he didn't shy away. He leaned into it, letting the imperfection become part of the truth he was offering. The word carried across the memorial with a weight that was impossible to ignore. Faces in the crowd shifted with emotion. A few people pressed hands to their lips. Others stood frozen, afraid to even blink. Keanu lifted his chin slightly as he prepared for the final line. Ray felt his heartbeat slow, steadying to match the rhythm of the moment. From sea to shining sea. The last note lingered, held not through vocal power, but through intention. Keanu let it hover softly in the air until his breath ran out, and the quiet return of silence settled over the grounds like a gentle blanket. For a long moment, no one moved. No one clapped. No one spoke. The stillness was absolute. Then someone in the back row began to clap. A single pair of hands, slow and deliberate. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, applause exploded across the entire memorial, echoing against the stone pillars, rising like a wave of gratitude. Ray flinched at first, overwhelmed by the sudden sound. But as the applause grew louder, something shifted in him. His shoulders loosened. His tears finally fell. And when he looked at Keanu standing beside him, he understood. He had not failed. He had been honored. The applause thundered across the memorial grounds, rolling through the open air like a wave of emotion too powerful to contain. Keanu stepped back from the microphone, his chest rising and falling with the soft rhythm of someone who had poured his heart into every word. He turned toward Ray, who still stood, frozen tears streaming silently down his cheeks as the sound washed over him. Ray didn't try to wipe his face. He didn't hide the emotion. He simply let himself feel it, overwhelmed by the unexpected dignity the moment had given him. His lungs trembled gently, but not from fear. For the first time in decades, the trembling came from something closer to hope. Keanu closed the distance between them in 2 slow steps. Without hesitation, he reached out and wrapped both arms around Ray, pulling him into a firm, steady embrace. Ray stiffened at first, not used to being held, not used to being comforted, but then his body softened, leaning into Keanu's chest, as if the moment was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. No words were spoken, none were needed. The embrace said everything. The applause softened, not because the emotion faded, but because the crowd instinctively understood they were witnessing something sacred. People lowered their hands, letting the moment breathe in silence. A few bowed their heads, others pressed their palms over their hearts again. Even the children quieted, sensing the weight of what was happening on that stage. The host stood off to the side, his eyes glassy. He swallowed hard, unable to hide the emotion pressing at the edges of his voice. Instead of rushing forward to keep the program moving, he stepped back. He gave the scene space. He let it happen. Photographers captured the moment from every angle. The 2 figures, one older, fragile, trembling with emotion, the other younger, steady, offering strength, looked almost symbolic against the vast stone columns of the memorial behind them. Camera shutters clicked, phones lifted, the embrace froze in countless images that would soon flood the internet. Somewhere in the front rows, a woman whispered, "Look at that. That's what compassion looks like." A teenage boy to her right nodded slowly, unable to look away. Behind them, a Marine in dress blues leaned toward the man beside him and murmured, "That man just gave him his voice back." The words weren't loud, but they found their way into the hearts of several people nearby. A few nodded, others whispered agreement. The sentiment spread through the crowd like a quiet revelation. Keanu finally loosened his embrace and stepped back slightly, his hands still resting on Ray's shoulders. Ray looked up at him, eyes red, eyelashes damp. He tried to speak, but only air came out at first. He swallowed, then whispered, "Thank you." The words were thin, but filled with sincerity. Keanu nodded, his expression gentle. "You earned this moment," he said softly. He kept one hand on Ray's back as he turned them toward the edge of the stage. Ray walked slowly, still gripping the folded flag, but his steps were steadier than before. He felt supported not only by Keanu's presence, but by the energy of the crowd around them. Every step away from the microphone felt like walking toward healing. Keanu guided Ray slowly toward the steps at the side of the stage, keeping a steady hand on his back to help him down. Ray moved cautiously, but the tremble in his legs had eased. His breaths were still uneven, yet each one felt a little fuller, a little less burdened. The applause behind them softened into scattered claps, then into a quiet hum of murmurs as people watched the 2 men descend together. When they reached the base of the steps, the crowd instinctively parted, creating a narrow walkway for them. Ray hesitated, unsure if he deserved such respect, but Keanu gave the slightest nod toward the path. The reassurance was enough. Ray stepped forward. As they walked, people reached out, not to stop them, not to overwhelm them, but simply to offer gratitude. A woman placed her hand gently over her heart and whispered, "Bless you both." A young man in a wheelchair gave Ray a small salute. A pair of teenagers, usually distracted by their phones, stood silently with wide eyes, watching them as if witnessing history. Ray felt his throat tighten again, but this time the emotion wasn't humiliation. It was something he hadn't felt in years, honor. A few steps ahead, a little girl with braided hair tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is everyone standing?" Her father knelt beside her and pointed gently toward Ray. "Because that man gave everything he said, and today someone gave something back to him." Ray overheard the words. His breath caught. Keanu slowed just enough to let Ray absorb them. Near the center of the aisle, a retired Marine with a scar running along his jaw stepped forward. His uniform was pristine, his posture still rigid with discipline. He stopped directly in front of Ray and offered a crisp salute. Ray instinctively tried to return it, shifting the folded flag to one arm, but the Marine shook his head softly and lowered his salute first. "You've done enough, Sergeant," the Marine said. "Let us carry the rest." Ray felt tears well again, but this time he didn't bow his head. He let the tears come. Keanu placed his hand reassuringly on Ray's shoulder again. His presence remained quiet, steady, never pushing Ray forward, just walking with him. Behind them, someone lifted a phone and snapped a photo. Within minutes, the image Keanu supporting Ray, as the crowd looked on, was uploaded to social media. It spread faster than anyone expected. The caption beneath the first post read, "A moment America needed." More people raised their phones, capturing the scene as the two men continued down the aisle. Yet no one shouted for attention. No one asked for autographs. Even those who recognized Keanu chose respect over excitement. At the far end of the aisle, Ray paused and turned to look back at the stage he had struggled on moments earlier. The fear he felt there was still real, still painful, but now joined by something else, something healing. He whispered to himself, "Maybe my voice wasn't lost." Keanu heard him and gave a small, meaningful nod. It never was. By the time Ray finally returned home that evening, the sun had already dipped behind the hills outside Arlington. The quiet of his small house greeted him like an old friend, steady and familiar, but something in the air felt different, lighter, warmer. He shut the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, gripping the folded flag close to his chest. His body ached with exhaustion, yet the heaviness he carried earlier no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a memory settling in a gentler place. He set his suitcase near the hallway and walked slowly into the living room. The house was dim, the shadows stretching long across the floor. Ray reached for the lamp and flicked it on. The warm glow filled the room, casting soft light onto the framed photo of his platoon on the mantel. He paused in front of it, brushing his fingertips over the dusty frame. "I made it through," he whispered. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself or to the men in the picture. The television remote rested beside his favorite chair. He picked it up, intending only to catch the evening news, maybe distract himself from the whirlwind of the day. But the moment the screen lit up, he froze. His own face filled the broadcast. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then the clip played Ray standing at the microphone, struggling for breath, eyes lowered. He winced as he watched the painful moment unfold again, his chest tightening with the memory of it. He was about to turn it off when Keanu appeared beside him on the screen, and suddenly, everything changed. He watched Keanu step forward, place a hand on his shoulder, whisper those quiet words only he and Keanu had shared. He watched the anthem unfold again this time, not as the man breaking under pressure, but as a witness to what followed. He saw the way the crowd rose. He saw people place their hands over their hearts. He saw veterans stand with trembling legs. He saw tears falling across faces he never knew. And he saw Keanu, steady, sincere, humble, singing not for fame, but for dignity. The channel anchor continued speaking. And this moment, now being called the honor stage moment, has swept across the nation tonight. Ray blinked. Honor stage moment. The news continued. Clips flashed from multiple angles, phone recordings, professional cameras, bystanders who'd captured it without even realizing its full meaning at the time. Some clips were shaky, others crisp, but each one held the same emotional core. The anchor added, "The video has surpassed 20 million views in just 8 hours and continues to climb. Veterans organizations across the country are calling it one of the most moving tributes ever captured on film." Ray sank slowly into his chair, unable to look away. A graphic appeared on the screen, 40,000 views in 24 hours. He stared at the number, overwhelmed. He had never imagined anyone would care about his story, let alone millions of strangers. And then the comments appeared, a montage of public reactions read aloud by the anchor. One stood out above the rest. Keanu didn't save the show, he saved that man's dignity. Ray's breath caught in his throat. His fingers trembled. A tear slipped down his cheek before he could stop it. He didn't wipe it away. He simply let it fall. Ray leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together as the broadcast continued. The news anchor shifted to another segment, but the screen kept returning to the same images. Keanu. Stepping forward, the embrace, the anthem rising over the memorial steps. Ray had never seen himself through anyone else's eyes. Watching it felt surreal, almost like witnessing the life of another man entirely. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. He ignored it at first, assuming it was a wrong number or a telemarketer. But when it buzzed again, then again he reached for it. Dozens of notifications lit up the screen. Messages from the local veterans center, missed calls from neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years, even a voicemail from the nurse at his doctor's office. He stared at the messages, bewildered. The newest alert came from an unknown number, a simple text. "Proud of you. Sergeant Douglas." Ray blinked at the screen, unsure why that single sentence hit him so hard. He set the phone down with a shaking hand and turned back to the television. Another news segment showed a panel of retired military officers discussing the clip. One of them, a white-haired colonel with a stern expression, spoke with conviction. "That man didn't fail," he said. His voice may be broken, but his courage never was. What Keanu did, he showed the country what real honor looks like. Ray covered his mouth with the back of his hand as the emotion swelled. He had spent 50 years believing that the night in Vietnam, the one where he sang through fear and loss, was buried too deep for anyone to remember. Yet here, strangers across the nation spoke about him as if his story mattered, as if he mattered. The clip played again this time, focusing on the moment Keanu placed a hand on Ray's shoulder. The anchor narrated softly. "In an era where so much feels divided, this moment has united viewers across backgrounds. No publicity, no script, just compassion." Ray watched the screen blur as tears filled his eyes once more. He didn't fight it. He let his forehead rest against his fingertips, the emotion finally spilling out in a way he hadn't allowed in decades. He whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you, Keanu." It was barely audible, but he knew the sentiment went somewhere deeper than his voice could reach. The clip ended, replaced by another wave of headlines. Ray sat back in his chair, overwhelmed but lighter than he had felt in a lifetime. By the next morning, Ray's story had already begun to move beyond the viral clip. News outlets across the country scrambled to learn more about the man whose broken voice and trembling hands had touched millions. Ray knew none of this as he sat quietly at his kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring out the window. The folded flag rested beside him, a constant companion. His phone buzzed repeatedly, but he ignored it, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Meanwhile, in a bustling newsroom in Washington, a young journalist named Emily Carter studied Ray's photo on her screen. Something about his eyes, the weight behind them, the quiet resilience pulled her in. She felt there was more to his story than what the viral moment captured. She clicked through public records, searching for any mention of Sergeant Raymond Douglas. At first, all she found were basic military details, enlistment dates, deployment records, medals awarded. But suddenly she froze. There were far more medals listed than she expected for a man who lived such a quiet life. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. Emily frowned. None of these had been mentioned during the ceremony. She clicked deeper into archived reports and paused again when she found a brief reference from 1970. A night ambush, heavy casualties, one squad trapped under enemy fire. Ray's name was at the center of the report. Her pulse quickened as she read further. According to the documentation, Ray had carried wounded soldiers from an exposed position to safety, making multiple trips through heavy gunfire. 12 men survived because of him. The report also noted that Ray had been critically injured in the process, but refused evacuation until his squad was accounted for. Emily leaned back in her chair, stunned. A hero like that had stood on stage the day before, believing he was nothing more than a frail old veteran who couldn't sing anymore. She opened another file and found a nurse's testimonial written decades ago. The words struck her immediately. "Sergeant Douglas was our angel in the jungle," the nurse wrote. "He sang to the wounded when morphine ran low. He held the dying when the medics were too overwhelmed. He carried us through nights we thought we wouldn't survive." Emily felt her throat tighten. She knew this was a story people needed to hear. She drafted an article immediately writing not about the viral clip alone, but about the man behind it. She wrote about the soldier who had risked his life again and again. She wrote about the quiet strength he had carried into the jungles of Vietnam, the compassion he had shown his fellow soldiers, the courage he had displayed even when his voice failed him. When the article went live, it spread almost as fast as the original video. Across the country, veterans sat up in their chairs. Some reached for old photos. Others wiped tears from their cheeks as they whispered, "I remember him." Younger service members shared the article with admiration. Families read it at their kitchen tables. Ray's quiet legacy was uncovered piece by piece, revealing a depth that no one except those who served beside him had ever known. And as the article continued to circulate, something remarkable began to happen. Letters started appearing. The first letter arrived before Ray had even finished reading Emily's article. It was slipped through his mail slot early in the morning, landing softly on the hallway rug. Ray didn't notice it at first, not until he wandered past and saw an envelope addressed in careful handwriting. There was no return address, only his name, Sergeant Raymond Douglas. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. He carried it to the kitchen table, sat down slowly, and opened it with cautious hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dear Sergeant Douglas," it began, "I was one of the boys you carried out that night. You probably don't remember me. I was only 19. You ran through fire to pull me to safety. I've lived 50 more years because of you. Yesterday, when I saw you on that stage, I broke down. You gave everything for us. You deserve every moment of honor coming your way." Ray lowered the letter and pressed his hand against his eyes. He hadn't expected anything like this. He wasn't sure he deserved it, but the letter had used the word lived, and that alone made his breath catch. By midday, 3 more letters arrived. One came from a man in Colorado who had never served, but wrote, "My father died in Vietnam. Thank you for singing to men like him. Thank you for giving comfort when the world was falling apart." Another came from a mother whose son was deployed overseas. "You showed the world what real courage looks like. My son watches your clip every morning before his shift." A third letter, shaky in handwriting, came from a veteran in hospice care. "You carried me out of that field. You probably thought I forgot. I didn't. I never did." Ray read each word slowly, letting the memories surface without pushing them away. By evening, the mail truck pulled up outside his house again. The driver stepped out with a stack of envelopes so large he needed both hands to carry it. "These are all for you, sir," he said with genuine respect. Ray stared at the stack in disbelief. "For me?" "Yes, sir, and more are coming tomorrow." Ray carried them inside, setting the stack gently on the kitchen table. Dozens of envelopes spilled slightly at the edges, forming a soft mountain of gratitude he never expected. He opened several more. Some contained stories of loss. Others held memories of shared fear. Many spoke of gratitude written by people who had never met him but felt connected through what they saw in the clip. One short letter from a retired medic read, "I remember your voice in the dark. It kept us alive." Ray closed his eyes as a tear rolled down his cheek. For the first time in decades, the silence in his home didn't feel empty. It felt full. Ray sat at his kitchen table the following morning, surrounded by opened envelopes and unfolded letters. The stack had grown overnight, a testament to how far his story had reached. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Every letter felt like a small miracle, a reminder that people still cared, that the past had not swallowed everything he once was. He read slowly, pausing often to let the messages settle. Some made him smile. Others made his chest tighten in ways he couldn't describe. He was halfway through a letter from a high school choir teacher when he heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the sharp, hurried knock of a delivery driver. This one was gentle, almost hesitant. Ray placed the letter down and pushed himself up. His legs were stiff, but the movement felt easier today. When he opened the door, he found a young courier standing on the porch, holding a rectangular box sealed neatly with brown tape. The courier checked the label, then looked at Ray with a hint of recognition. "Are you Sergeant Raymond Douglas?" he asked. Ray nodded slowly. "This is for you, sir. Signature required." Ray signed the clipboard with a shaky hand. The courier offered him a respectful nod before stepping back down the porch steps. Ray closed the door and carried the package to the kitchen table. It wasn't heavy, but it felt significant in his hands. There was no return address. He sat down carefully and studied the package. Something about it made him pause, as though the moment needed a breath before unfolding. Then he reached for a small kitchen knife and cut through the tape. The flaps opened with a soft tear, revealing another box inside this one black polished and bearing no logo. Ray lifted the inner box out and set it gently on the table. His heart beat a little faster, though he couldn't explain why. With slow hands, he opened the lid. Inside, nestled in soft velvet fabric, was a vintage microphone. Ray's breath caught. It wasn't a cheap replica or a decorative piece. It was an authentic classic studio microphone, the kind used in old recordings from the 60s and 70s, sleek, silver timeless. He reached out and brushed his fingertips against the metal, feeling its cool surface. The sight of it stirred memories he hadn't touched in decades. Not memories of the war, but of music, of what singing once meant to him. Beside the microphone lay a folded note. Ray stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. The paper was thick, high quality, the kind used for something personal. The handwriting was clean, steady, unmistakably deliberate. Ray unfolded it. Your voice never left Ray. It just needed to be heard in a new way. Keanu. Ray's eyes blurred as he read the message again. He hadn't expected anything like this. Keanu's gesture at the ceremony had already changed something deep inside him. But this felt like a reminder. A bridge. A quiet invitation to reclaim something he thought was lost forever. He set the note down carefully, swallowing hard. Then he noticed something else tucked beneath the velvet lining. A record. Ray lifted the soft velvet lining with careful fingers, revealing a vinyl record beneath it. The cover featured a minimalist black and white image, elegant in its simplicity. Across the top in silver lettering were the words, Dog Star, Limited Studio Edition. His breath stilled. He had heard of Dog Star, of course. Everyone who followed Keanu's quieter work knew the band had a cult following. But Ray had never owned a record like this. Limited editions weren't things men on modest pensions usually purchased. He picked it up gently, running his fingertips over the embossed lettering. It felt unreal, like holding a piece of someone's honest self. Beneath the record, another slip of paper rested against the bottom of the box. Ray pulled it free. This one wasn't a note. Rather, it was an invitation printed in simple, understated text. Private Studio Session, Los Angeles. You're welcome anytime. At the bottom was a handwritten addition. I'd like to make music with you, even if it's just one note. Ray felt the corners of his mouth tremble. He clasped the record to his chest, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had received. The microphone, the note, the invitation. None of it felt flashy or performative. It felt sincere. It felt like someone reaching back after he had finally found the courage to reach forward. He placed the record gently on the table, then lifted the microphone from its velvet cradle. It fit perfectly into his hand, as if waiting for him. He brought it closer, studying the small scratches that revealed its history. This microphone had been used. It had lived through years of music stories and echoes of different hearts. And now it was his. Ray carried the microphone to his living room, set it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. Eventually he sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He whispered, "Why would he do all this for me?" The answer surfaced quietly. Because Keanu understood loss. Because he had seen something in Ray that Ray hadn't seen in himself for years. Because compassion sometimes moved with quiet certainty. Ray wiped his eyes and chuckled softly, surprised by the warmth spreading through his chest. He reached for a glass of water, took a slow sip, then turned toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the sky, brightening the edges of his small yard. On impulse, he stood and walked over to the harmonica resting on his bookshelf. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight and worn metal. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if his lungs would cooperate. But then he raised it to his lips and blew a single soft note. It came out weak, airy, but present. He breathed out a shaky laugh, lowering the harmonica slowly. "Maybe my voice didn't leave," he whispered. "Maybe it was waiting." Behind him, the microphone gleamed silently in the warm light, as if agreeing. Ray arrived at the Dog Star studio in Los Angeles 3 days later, holding the vintage microphone case, like it was something fragile and irreplaceable. The trip had been long, but the invitation in his pocket guided him more than the maps did. As he stepped out of the car, the warm California air brushed against his face. The building in front of him was modern and simple, with wide windows that reflected the late morning sun. It didn't look intimidating, yet Ray felt a weight of nerves settle in his chest. He took a moment before entering, steadying his breath. When he finally pushed open the glass door, the cool air inside greeted him. A staff member at the front desk looked up with a smile that suggested she already knew who he was. "Sergeant Douglas," she asked gently. Ray nodded. "Mr. Reeves is expecting you. Right through the hall, second door on the right." Ray walked slowly, his boots echoing softly against the polished floor. When he reached the studio door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle for a long moment. He wasn't afraid of anything in particular. He was simply overwhelmed by the idea that someone like Keanu wanted him here, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a collaborator. He finally opened the door. Inside, the studio was warm and dimly lit with acoustic panels lining the walls and soft lights casting a golden glow over the equipment. Keanu stood near a microphone stand, adjusting a set of headphones. When he glanced up and saw Ray, a genuine smile crossed his face. "You made it," Keanu said, stepping forward. Ray nodded, unsure how to hide the awe in his expression. "Wasn't sure I belonged here," he admitted. Keanu shook his head softly. "You belong exactly here." He gestured toward a second microphone stand placed beside his own. On the table next to it sat a pair of headphones and a printed sheet of lyrics. Ray approached slowly, setting his microphone case down with careful hands. Keanu tapped the music stand lightly. "I was thinking," he began, "that we could do a simple version. Just guitar, a soft instrumental, and your voice speaking the verses you can't sing anymore." Ray looked up sharply. "My voice is barely there," he said. Keanu nodded. "Exactly. That's why it's powerful." Ray swallowed hard, the idea settling deeper than he expected. "What would I be saying?" Keanu handed him the lyric sheet. "Whatever feels real. Words you meant back then. Words that still matter now." Ray studied the page. It wasn't filled with lyrics. Instead, it held short phrases, prompts meant to guide him. "For those we lost, one read. For those who never came home. Another. For those who carried burdens no one saw." Ray traced the words with his thumb. "I can try," he whispered. "That's all we need," Keanu said. He moved back to his microphone, placing the headphones around his neck. Ray did the same, adjusting the stand until it felt right. The recording engineer gave a small signal from behind the glass. Keanu nodded. "Let's make something for them," he said. "For the ones who can't sing anymore." Ray closed his eyes. It was time. The engineer pressed a button, and the soft instrumental began to play through the studio speakers. It was gentle and sparse, mostly piano and a low, warm hum of guitar beneath it. The melody carried a quiet ache, the kind that made Ray's breath catch in his chest. He lifted the headphones fully over his ears, hearing the world narrow into something intimate and focused. Keanu stepped closer to his microphone, closing his eyes for a brief moment before beginning the first line. His voice entered low, steady, and full of the same raw sincerity that had filled the air at the Lincoln Memorial. Unlike the stage performance, this take had a softer, more vulnerable quality. It wasn't a performance for a crowd. It was a message meant for the ones who had lived and the ones who hadn't. Oh, beautiful. For spacious skies. Ray felt his ribs tighten with the memory of singing those words decades earlier under a sky filled with smoke and fear. He didn't attempt to sing. He waited, listening closely for the cue the engineer had given him. When the instrumental softened after the first verse, Ray stepped toward his microphone. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "For those we carried through the dark," he said. The microphone caught every texture of his breath, turning weakness into presence. He paused, letting the moment settle before continuing. For the ones who held on, even when the night felt endless. His throat tightened midway through the line, but he didn't stop. He pushed gently through it, letting the truth of the words matter more than the smoothness of his delivery. Keanu took the next part of the anthem, his voice layering over the instrumental with deep emotion. "For amber waves of grain." His tone cracked on the last word. He didn't correct it. He didn't redo it. He simply continued, allowing the imperfection to deepen the song's meaning. Ray lifted his eyes to the glass window and saw the engineer watching them with visible emotion. The young man wiped his cheek discreetly, pretending to adjust a cable. Ray looked away, overwhelmed, and returned to the lyric sheet in his hand. When the music dipped again, he spoke once more. For the ones who never made it back home, and for the ones who kept their stories buried. The room felt heavier, filled with memories. Neither man spoke aloud. Keanu responded by singing the next lines even softer, as if matching Ray's tone out of respect. "America, America." Ray felt his eyes sting. There were so many voices he remembered, some strong, some fading, some silenced forever. And now, somehow, those voices felt present again, hovering in the quiet between the notes. As the instrumental swelled toward the end, Keanu stepped back slightly and glanced at Ray. It wasn't a signal to finish. It was an invitation. Ray whispered his final line, "For those who can't." The words trembled, but they landed with the force of truth. The instrumental faded. Silence filled the studio. The recording of "For Those Who Can't" was released quietly, just as Keanu intended. No press conference, no advertising, no dramatic announcement. It appeared online at dawn one morning, accompanied only by a single sentence posted on the studio's official page, "For the ones we remember, for the ones we still carry." Within hours, the song spread across the nation like a spark catching on dry grass. Teachers shared it. Veterans reposted it. Families listened to it at their kitchen tables. The simplicity of Ray's spoken words, paired with Keanu's raw, steady voice, touched people in places they rarely allowed themselves to feel. By the second day, schools across the country began playing the recording during morning assemblies. Some played it instead of the usual anthem. Others used it during moments of reflection. Videos surfaced online of classrooms full of children listening in silence, their hands over their hearts, teachers standing nearby with tears in their eyes. One school in Ohio filmed their entire student body standing in the gym, lights dimmed, the recording echoing through the space. A caption below the video read, "Teaching honor, teaching empathy." Ray saw the clip on his computer and covered his mouth, gently overwhelmed by how far the message had traveled. He never imagined the voice he lost would inspire so many voices to rise. That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a new notification, a voice message marked from an unfamiliar number. Ray pressed play hesitantly. A young boy's voice came through, soft and slightly strained. "Hi, Mr. Douglas," the boy said, pausing between words as if choosing them carefully. "My name is Daniel. I have trouble talking sometimes. People don't always understand me, but when I heard your voice, it made me feel brave." Ray's chest tightened. The boy continued, "Thank you for speaking, even when it was hard. I'm trying too." The message ended abruptly, but the silence afterward was profound. Ray sat back in his chair, blinking through the tears he could no longer hold back. The idea that a child, someone who knew the struggle of feeling unheard, found strength in his broken voice filled Ray with a warmth he hadn't felt since his youth. Across the country, a veterans choir in Texas decided to recreate the performance that had captured the nation. They gathered in a small auditorium, many of them using canes, walkers, or wheelchairs. Their voices varied, some strong, some gravelly with age, but together they formed a deep, resonant harmony. They sang the anthem in honor of Ray, and when the instrumental dipped, the choir members spoke phrases similar to the ones Ray had recorded. For the brothers we lost in the dust, for the ones who held the line, for the ones whose voices faded into the night. A clip of their performance went viral, drawing millions of views. People wrote comments like, "This country needed this, and honor lives in moments like these." Everywhere. Ray looked, he saw echoes of the moment at the Lincoln Memorial, reborn in classrooms, auditoriums, backyards, and community halls. What happened between him and Keanu had become something larger than either of them. And America was still reacting. The national response didn't stop with schools and choirs. As the days passed, communities across the country began adding their own tributes. Churches played the recording before Sunday services. Local radio stations aired it during sunrise broadcasts. Veterans organizations held small gatherings where members sat together, listened, and shared stories they hadn't spoken aloud in decades. One morning, Ray woke to a message from a Veterans Day parade coordinator in Chicago. The parade committee had unanimously voted to include a moment of silence dedicated to what they called the man who lost his voice and the man who sang for him. Ray read the message twice, his breath unsteady. He couldn't imagine receiving an honor like that. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But the sincerity in the message convinced him otherwise. Across the nation, other parades adopted the same tribute. Some paused their entire route. Others played the recording through loudspeakers. In one town, a school marching band stopped mid-performance and lowered their instruments in quiet reflection. Parents along the sidewalks bowed their heads. Veterans saluted. Children fell silent, sensing they were participating in something meaningful. Ray watched a news clip of the Chicago parade's tribute. The camera panned across a crowd, tens of thousands strong. People placed hands over their hearts. The announcer's voice grew soft. "This moment," he said, "is for every soldier who returned home, changed, for every voice that trembled but still tried to speak, and for every act of compassion that helps carry them." Ray closed his eyes as the recording began to play through the television speakers. Keanu's gentle singing filled his home once more, followed by his own recorded whispers woven through the melody. He held onto the arms of his chair, feeling each word settle deeper. He barely noticed when another notification buzzed on his phone. This one came from a community center in Florida. The message contained a video clip from a small veterans group gathered outdoors. Their leader, an elderly man with a weathered face and bright eyes, stood before a small crowd and explained why they were gathered. "We're here because one man reminded us that courage doesn't disappear," the leader said. "It sometimes changes form. It sometimes becomes quiet. It sometimes needs another voice to help carry it." They held a lantern lighting ceremony afterward, one lantern for every soldier in their group who had lost their life after returning home. The lanterns floated gently across a small lake, reflecting golden streaks on the water. As they drifted outward, the group played the Dog Star recording softly on a portable speaker. Ray watched the lanterns glow against the dark sky on his screen. He felt the years of silence inside him, not as a weight anymore, but as something finally released. He whispered to himself, "They're remembering. After all this time, they're remembering." The reaction wasn't just national, it was personal. It reached into quiet corners of America where veterans lived alone, where families struggled with unspoken grief, where children learned what dignity looked like. And everywhere, Ray's story continued to ripple outward. Ray waited 3 full days before making the drive. He needed time not for publicity, not for anyone else's expectations, but to feel ready. The letters, the messages, the tributes, the recording. Everything had stirred memories he kept buried deep. Memories of men he served with, men who never came home, men who carried pieces of him he could never reclaim. But one name pulled at him more than the others: Private Samuel Sam Harlow. It had been 55 years since Sam died in Ray's arms on a humid night in the jungle, the sound of distant gunfire echoing through the trees. Sam had been only 22. He had asked Ray in a trembling whisper to sing something familiar, something that reminded him of home. Ray remembered the way his own voice had cracked as he sang the first lines of America the Beautiful, trying to steady the young man's breathing even as the medics rushed toward them too late. Ray never forgot the sound of Sam's last breath. Now, as he drove toward the military cemetery outside Washington, he kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on the case that held the vintage microphone. His portable speaker lay beside it. The sky was pale blue, brushed with the soft warmth of late afternoon. A gentle wind rustled the trees lining the road. When Ray arrived, he stepped out of the car slowly. The crisp air stung his lungs in a familiar way, but it didn't frighten him anymore. He closed the door carefully and walked toward the rows of white headstones. The grass beneath his boots was soft, and each step echoed in his chest like a memory being unburied. He found Sam's grave near the far edge of the cemetery. The headstone stood clean and dignified, engraved with simple words. P.T. Samuel Harlow, United States Army, 1948, 1970. Home at last. Ray stood in front of the stone for a long moment. His breath shook, his hand trembled. The weight of half a century settled over him, but it no longer felt like a burden he carried alone. He lowered himself slowly to his knees. The grass bent beneath his weight. He placed the portable speaker gently at the base of the tombstone, adjusting its angle so the sound would face the headstone directly. He hesitated for a long moment before turning it on. The first soft notes of the recording filled the quiet cemetery. Keanu's voice rose gently over the instrumental, raw and steady. Then Ray's own spoken words entered fragile, imperfect trembling with truth. For those we carried through the dark. Ray bowed his head as the memories washed over him. He could almost feel the jungle heat on his skin. Hear Sam's uneven breathing, see the fear in his eyes soften as Ray sang to him that night. Now, after decades of silence, he had returned. He whispered, "I told you I'd sing for you again." His voice cracked, but the words came out whole. The recording continued to play, drifting across the headstones like a soft prayer carried on the wind. Ray closed his eyes and let the moment settle into him. He didn't hear footsteps approaching from behind. Ray kept his eyes closed as the recording played, unaware of anything except the voice of the past speaking through the present. The quiet tremble of Keanu's singing, mixed with Ray's own spoken lines, wrapped around him like a memory becoming whole again. He didn't turn when he heard someone stop, several feet behind him. There was no tension in the air, no reason for caution, only presence. After a moment, Ray opened his eyes and turned his head slightly. Keanu stood a few paces back, hands in the pockets of his jacket, shoulders relaxed. There were no cameras, no entourage, no reporters, just a man who understood why someone might need silence more than anything else. Ray exhaled softly. "Didn't expect anyone," he whispered. Keanu stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. "I figured you might come here," he said quietly. "Didn't want you to be alone unless you wanted to be." Ray nodded, appreciating the unspoken offer. He didn't ask how Keanu found him. The answer didn't matter. Some moments didn't need explanation. Keanu lowered himself to the grass beside Ray, his movements slow, matching the tone of the place. They both faced the tombstone. The speaker continued playing their recording, the soft pulse of the melody drifting upward like a gentle tribute. Ray swallowed hard. "This was the last place I heard my own voice," he said. "The night Sam died." After that, it felt wrong to sing again. Keanu didn't speak right away. He let the wind carry the sound of the recording between them. When he finally answered, his voice was steady. "Maybe it wasn't wrong," he said. "Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to return." Ray blinked against the sting in his eyes. 55 years, he murmured. I carried his voice with me everywhere. I thought I owed him a song I could never give. Keanu looked at him gently. "You gave him more than a song. You gave him comfort. You gave him your presence. You gave him peace." Ray let the words settle inside him. Slowly, he placed one hand on the grass, grounding himself. "I didn't think anyone remembered him," he said. "Not the way I did." "I think they remember now," Keanu replied, nodding toward the speaker. "And they'll keep remembering." They sat in silence after that, letting the recording play through its final lines. The last whisper, Ray's voice, saying, "For those who can't seem to linger in the air long after the music faded." Ray closed his eyes again. This time the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful, shared, honored. Keanu leaned back slightly on his hands, gazing at the horizon, where the sky dipped into shades of soft gold. "He'd be proud of you," he said. Ray took a long, steady breath. "I hope so." They stayed there without speaking. Two men sitting on the grass listening to a tribute meant for someone who had once meant everything. A moment without cameras, a moment without noise, a moment of stillness that belonged only to them. 1 year passed not quietly and not loudly either, just with a steady hum of change that spread through Ray's life, piece by piece. The country did not forget him. If anything, the months only deepened the impact of the moment he once believed was a failure. People still shared the clip, schools still played the song, veterans still sent letters. And Ray, now a year older but somehow lighter in spirit, found himself stepping into a role he never expected. It began with a small invitation from a local middle school. The principal wrote to him saying the students were studying courage and wanted to hear from someone who had lived it. Ray hesitated at first, unsure whether his voice could carry across a classroom. But something inside him, something that had once remained buried, encouraged him to try. He accepted. On the morning of the event, Ray arrived at the school wearing a clean, pressed shirt and the same dress shoes he had worn to the Lincoln Memorial. He walked through the halls slowly, taking in the sound of lockers clicking and children laughing. A teacher greeted him warmly and led him to the assembly room, where a group of students were waiting on metal chairs arranged in neat rows. When he stepped inside, the room fell quiet with curiosity. Ray approached the podium carefully, one hand resting lightly on its edge for balance. He cleared his throat softly, feeling the familiar roughness that still lived there. His voice would never return to what it once was, but it didn't need to. "Good morning," he said. His voice was thin but steady. The children leaned forward, listening closely. "I was asked to speak to you today about courage," Ray continued. "But I want you to understand something important. Courage isn't loud. It isn't big. It isn't the person shouting the longest or standing in the brightest spotlight." He paused to catch his breath. A few students nodded gently. "Courage," he said slowly, "is what stands up when no one else will. It's what stays when everything in you wants to run. Sometimes, courage is just showing up." The words rang through the room, not because of volume, but because of truth. The teacher standing near the doorway wiped her eyes. Several children looked at Ray with expressions of quiet respect, as if seeing a different kind of hero than the ones printed in textbooks. Ray continued speaking, telling them simple stories from his life. Not the darkest parts, not the trauma he still carried, but the moments where small choices mattered. He told them about his platoon, about singing through fear, about the way hope sometimes hid in the smallest actions. When he finished, the students gave him a gentle, heartfelt round of applause. Not thunderous, not dramatic, just honest. Afterward, a boy approached him and said, "My mom says I'm shy, but maybe I'm brave too." Ray smiled. "I believe you are." He went home feeling something warm settle into his chest. It did not stop there. More invitations came: schools, veteran centers, youth programs, support groups. Ray traveled more in that year than he had in the previous 20. His voice grew no stronger, but his presence did. He never bragged. He never asked for attention. He simply showed up again and again, offering the same message each time. Ray's message reached places he never imagined. At veteran centers, men who had kept their stories buried for decades opened up after hearing him speak. They told him his quiet strength reminded them that they didn't have to hide their pain to deserve respect. Some cried openly for the first time. Others simply sat beside him, grateful for the company of someone who understood without explanation. At a youth rehabilitation program in Maryland, Ray spoke to a group of teenagers who had grown up believing their voices didn't matter. His presence changed the room. When he finished speaking, a young girl whispered, "I didn't think anyone like you would understand someone like me." Ray had placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "You matter, and your voice will carry further than you think." Word spread, more invitations arrived. Ray accepted only the ones he felt emotionally ready for. He didn't rush. He didn't let the nation push him faster than he could go. He moved at his own pace, steady and humble. Everywhere he went, he carried the vintage microphone Keanu had given him. He used it to speak when his voice felt too thin. Listeners said the soft crackle of the old microphone made his words feel even more sincere. Meanwhile, in Washington, a mural began to take shape on the side of a community arts building in the heart of D.C. The muralist, a young veteran's daughter, inspired by the viral moment, designed it to capture both men standing together at the Lincoln Memorial. Ray was painted with his hand on his chest, eyes lifted fragile and dignified. Keanu stood beside him, angled toward the microphone, singing. The background featured soft waves of muted blue and white, echoing the colors of the sky above the memorial that day. As the mural neared completion, crowds gathered to watch. Some brought flowers, others brought their children. Veterans saluted quietly before walking away. The mural wasn't loud or flashy. It was gentle, reflective, and full of heart. People said it felt like standing in the moment that had healed so many. Ray visited the mural one afternoon, escorted by a staff member from the local Veterans Center. He stood there silently staring at the painted version of himself. He didn't know what to say. His throat ached with emotion. When the staff member asked if he liked it, Ray whispered, "It's more than I deserve." But the warmth in his eyes said something different, something grateful. Late one night, long after visitors had gone, another figure approached the mural. Quietly, hands in his pockets, wearing a simple dark jacket. Keanu stood before the wall, looking up at the painting illuminated by streetlights. He didn't take pictures. He didn't call attention to himself. He just stood there, breathing in the stillness. After several minutes, he whispered softly, "You did good, Ray." Then he walked away into the calm night, unnoticed and unrecognized. The year had changed Ray in ways he never expected, not by lifting him into fame or placing him in the public eye, but by bringing him back to a place inside himself he thought had disappeared decades ago. Every speech he gave, every letter he received, every child who told him he mattered, they all stitched pieces of him back together. His voice was still fragile, his breath still thin, but his spirit, the part of him he believed the war had taken forever, had grown steady again. And through everything, Keanu remained present in the quiet way only he could manage. He never stepped into Ray's spotlight. He never gave interviews about what happened. He never let the world turn the moment into something about him. Instead, he reached out through handwritten notes, brief phone calls, and gentle reminders that Ray had earned everything he was becoming. One afternoon, as summer warmed the edges of Arlington, Ray sat on his porch with the vintage microphone resting in his lap. The world had grown calm again. The whirlwind of viral attention had settled into something gentler, respect, admiration, and a quiet understanding shared between millions of strangers. Birds chirped in the yard. A breeze drifted across the porch. Ray placed one hand on the microphone and let his mind drift back to that moment at the Lincoln Memorial. He remembered the weight of the silence before Keanu stood. He remembered the crack in his breath. He remembered bowing his head, certain he had failed. And he remembered the feeling of Keanu's hand on his shoulder, steady, warm, grounding. A gesture that had given him back more than a voice. It had given him dignity. Ray exhaled slowly, the air catching slightly in his throat. He lifted the microphone toward his lips, not to speak, but as a quiet gesture of gratitude. The porch fell still, as if listening. He whispered, "Some voices never go away. They just wait for someone to listen." He wasn't quoting Keanu. He was agreeing with him. Ray lowered the microphone and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in his life, the silence didn't frighten him. It didn't remind him of the things he lost or the years he spent trying to forget. Instead, the silence felt full, carrying the echoes of every life he touched, every classroom he visited, every veteran who thanked him, and every note he whispered into the microphone for those who couldn't. As the sky began to dim into shades of soft orange, Ray closed his eyes and let the warmth settle across his face. His heartbeat felt even. His breath felt calm. His spirit felt whole. He didn't notice the camera crew filming across the street. They weren't there. This wasn't a moment for the world. This was a moment for him, for healing, for reflection, for honoring the long road that brought him home again. As the evening settled around Ray's quiet home, Keanu arrived without calling ahead. His motorcycle rumbled softly as he eased it to a stop near the fence, the engine fading into a gentle silence. He removed his helmet, shook out his hair, and walked up the path with the slow, familiar steps of someone who didn't want to disturb the peace that had settled over the porch. Ray opened his eyes at the sound of footsteps, and a small smile warmed his tired features. He didn't need words to greet Keanu. He simply nodded a gesture that carried the weight of everything between them. Gratitude, trust, and the bond formed in a moment neither man had expected, but both would carry for the rest of their lives. Keanu stepped onto the porch and pulled up the old rocking chair beside Ray. He didn't ask how Ray was doing. He didn't offer condolences or encouragement. He sat, let out a slow breath, and looked out over the yard. The simple presence of another person made the air feel softer. They stayed that way for several minutes, listening to the wind moving through the trees. Ray rested his hand on the microphone, resting beside him on the armrest. Keanu noticed but didn't comment. He understood that some objects weren't just things. They were symbols stitched into memory. After a while, Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. His voice came gently, almost blending into the breeze. "You've given a lot this year," he said. "Maybe more than people realize." Ray looked down, shoulders rising and falling in a quiet breath. "Feels like I'm finally giving what I should have given a long time ago." "You gave plenty," Keanu answered without hesitation. "You just didn't have anyone to remind you." Ray's eyes softened. "And you did." Keanu didn't respond with words. He let the silence carry the truth between them. The porch light flickered on automatically as the sky darkened, casting a warm glow over both men. Ray adjusted his posture, the stiffness in his joints showing more this year than the last. Keanu noticed and shifted his own chair closer, not to help but to share the moment with more presence. "You ever think about that night?" Ray asked quietly. Keanu nodded. "Every time I hear the anthem." Ray chuckled faintly, the sound thin but warm. "Never thought I'd hear my voice in a recording again. Didn't think it mattered anymore." "It mattered to them," Keanu said. "It mattered to the ones you sang for back then. And it matters now." Ray swallowed emotion tight in his throat. "You really believe that I wouldn't say it if I didn't?" The breeze picked up again, rustling the trees. Ray closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound fill the quiet space between them. When he opened them again, Keanu was still there, steady as always. In that small, shared moment, Ray felt something settle inside him. Not closure, not finality, just peace. And peace was enough.